Abubakar Yusuf Sab. We brother don't give evidence from the Quran. Now I want for make you look to the other side and the hadith, the sayings of Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If some evidence indeed with regards to the crucifixion for say indeed Nabila alayhi salam not be died on the cross, and I believe the Promised Messiah alayhi salam bring some hadith them inside this book for proof for say Nabila Isa alayhi salam not died on the cross.
Mashallah. Indeed, inside Jesus in India, the Promised Messiah alayhi salam, he quotes hadith them to the effect say Jesus not be dying on a cross. No. And if he put up the confirmation that these hadiths, they're not hadiths way strange to people, but they inside famous books of hadith. And one of them, na Kanzu Umar. They say the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say Jesus alayhi salam be live for 125 years. So when we see the evidences the Promised Messiah put, Jesus be there at the age of 33, where the incident of the crucifixion will take place. So, and the Prophet ﷺ say, he lived for 125 years, meaning Jesus be survived crucifixion and live to the ripe old age of 125.
Now, somebody where they listen this program, as we don't get evidence from the Bible, from the Quran, from the Hadith. It want also for know if we will forget evidence from medical point of view. I believe that the Promised Messiah alayhi salam, he also brings some medical point of view for sure say indeed Nabila Isa alayhi salam not be died at the cross. So first of all, I start with brother Jibril Kurumasai on this side before make you go help you explain.
Yes, thank you very much. He focus on one ointment, one medicine where they do is for cure the wounds them, where he call them Marami Isa. And the Promised Messiah alayhi salatu wasalam, he say this na a medicine where before say the people who study about medicine, both of them, they understand this medicine, so they know I'm a well-known medicine that is powerful for cure wounds them, for make it stop bleeding, quick one. And they know I'm for say this not to embalming medicine. For say if they go for good treatment, they will give a person they embalm for like no routine at all, not to that. Being that they be use them to for make them go mend the wounds them of Nabi Isa, and even the Bible John chapter 19 also mentions say they go to medicine them, they go to myrrh and aloe mention, but the book the Promised Messiah say the word where they mention inside the medicine books them na Marami Isa, they call them the ointment of Jesus Christ. You see, in fact, not even one language. You see, they translate in Arabic, other languages like Greek, and also the Muslims, the Christians, them, the Sikh, and the Hindus, them, all the medical literatures, they mention them. You see, so this being that in present, and then know for say they make them purposely for Nabi Isa alayhi salam, you see, this is not sufficient evidence for say Nabi Isa alayhi salam, he not be die. If he be die, then what's the need for making them treat possible don't die?
For a beautiful point where you don't make for say indeed somebody we don't die you make medicine where be say in there for wounds. So brother Munisa, what you go out to what you brother Jibril don't say in this regard?
Yes, indeed. The Promised Messiah salam about Marhami Isa, he explained very detail that not to medicine way is strange to the world, because now medicine way different scholars then be done write about them and then books then they be done they use them different learning institutions them we popularly known in the world. The Promised Messiah salam is a that Marhami Isa, the ointment of Jesus. The book one of the writers them na Bu Ali Sina we write the book Kanun. It's a now very popular book where you see the Jews, them, the Magians, the Christians, the Arab, the Persians, the Greek, the Romans, the Germans, and even the French people, and even the ancient libraries of Europe and Asia. Their books they say you go find inside them the Hakai. So this book beautifully explain about how they develop, which kind of ingredients them they put into that medicine there, so they became very, very strong painkiller, and also for heal, bleeding, for stop bleeding. So the Promised Messiah salam say they were all proof for show say Jesus alayhi salam be survived crucifixion. This is say even further explain that this not going to be something where person go even feel say Muslim they forge this one. because these books them they be don't live before Islam come. And it not be there one side of the people, but it spread all over the world, different nations, different languages. Them they don't translate this book into them, meaning a book is very, very popular and a true record for say yes, they be use this medicine for heal Jesus.
That's wonderful. You say Jazakallah to Brother Munir Obaka Yusuf Sahib for this beautiful explanation where he don't give with regards to this Marami Isa, the ointment of Jesus Christ alayhi salam, that not to kona medicine, a medicine will be say well known even before the people we don't join Islam with the Muslim, a medicine will be say other nations that they use them as well. So we don't learn Boku from what you don't say. All the evidences there don't tell you for say really Jesus Christ alayhi salam not be die na the cross, God Almighty be for 7 days. So now that time permit we for the discussion of this program here. So today, gentlemen, I say Jazakumullah, Asana Jaza, may God Almighty bless now for the contribution we don't give towards the program. Dear viewers, now this we get for una today, now in time don't permit we for make we go explain to unu. So I encourage each and every one of una for make una visit the official website when www.alislam.org. Go to the library and look for the books of the Promised Messiah alayhi salam. You go see Jesus in India. Then you go be for reader for your very self. We go understand in detail and better way they carry out the Promised Messiah alayhi salam. Don't explain the way our Almighty be saved Nabila Isa alayhi salam from the death on the cross. And for the one day now we country, I will encourage them for make them can now we headquarters. We now 15 bus to free time for make them come buy the hard copy day with small amount we go before buy and read them. And until we meet again next time, I say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
वक्त था वक्त मसीहा न किसी और का वक्त मैं ना आता तो कोई और ही आया होता.
My name is Samuel Bangwa, a camera operator at SLBC. I always capture the scene you see on TV. So stay glued to the public broadcaster.
My name is Abdul Kabia, a news anchor and sports producer at SLBC.
Hello, I am Esther Mahisama, important presenter of SLBC Sport.
I am Princess Gibson, executive producer, radio, gatekeeping, radio content, producer, public squire, your program that brings you conversation on topical issues, and also presents our breakfast show, Good Morning Sierra Leone.
Hello, my name is Daphne Zainab Kamara. I am a television producer at the SLBC. I also read the news on television and present the podium on television too. I also announce on radio. Stay tuned to the SLBC.
Providing authentic information has been one of the pillars that SLBC relies on. I am Mohamed Simbiko Omar, a reporter who has developed insatiable appetite for human interest stories. Continue to stay with Sierra Leone Broadcasting Corporation for your best in broadcast journalism.
As a public broadcaster, we believe in giving out objective stories, and your interest is our concern. I am Moses Sile Conte, a reporter at the Sierra Leone Broadcasting Corporation. Stay tuned.
Sierra Leone is a country on a new path of development, a new direction. As we awaken to a new sense of patriotism and pride as Sierra Leoneans, the SLBC brings together enlightened senior citizens with much experience to help steer Sierra Leoneans on the path of a defined course of pride and consciousness, a constructive nationalism. So, join the SLBC for the program Constructive Nationalism. Come and let's build Sierra Leone every Saturday at 3 p.m. on the SLBC. Constructive Nationalism on the SLBC.
Peace, alafia, shalom, assalamu alaikum. I am your host, The Last Griot. To know thyself is to know your history. And in this series, we'll be breaking down the history of the West African country, Sierra Leone. Did you know that archaeological finds show that Sierra Leone has been inhabited continuously for at least 2,500 years, populated successively by societies who migrated from other parts of Western and Central Africa? Its earliest documentation is noted as an outpost or outer territory of the Great Mali Empire, and the following centuries would slowly see Sierra Leone become a place of refuge for those escaping Islamic conversion, enslavement, and warfare from larger nations. There are 18 different ethnic groups in Sierra Leone today. The indigenous tribes of Sierra Leone would be the Limba, Bolom, and Loko. The other 14 would migrate into the region in later periods. Those who came from Mali and Guinea would become the Timni, Mende, Madingo, Kono, Yalunka, Karunko, Suzu, and Gizi. Sierra Leone would also receive the Karu, Karim, Galina, Gola, and Vai from Liberia. The Creole people would be a result of liberated slaves from the Americas being resettled in Sierra Leone by the British. They have one of the most interesting stories because the Creole today are the closest African relatives of Black Americans due to their ancestors having to leave behind parents, siblings, uncles, and aunties behind in America, Canada, and the Caribbean. The Creoles today still bear the same English surnames as their family who remained in America. For example, if you're from the Williams family in South Carolina, you may have a great-grandfather who migrated to Sierra Leone and continued another lineage of the Williams family there. The Limba are believed to be the earliest indigenous people of Sierra Leone. They speak a distinctive language that is unrelated to other languages in Sierra Leone. They are primarily found in the northern province, particularly in Bambali district, Koinadugu, Cambia, and Tonkolili, but a small number can still be found in Guinea. During Sierra Leone's colonial era, thousands of Limbas migrated to the capital city of Freetown and its western area. During the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, many Limba people were shipped to North America as slaves. The Limba are mainly rice farmers, traders, and hunters who lived in the Savannah woodland region in the northern province of Sierra Leone. They predominate in 16 out of 190 rural chiefdoms in the country, and their community affairs are dominated by the local paramount chiefs. Major Limba towns include Bafodia, the Warawara Yagala chiefdom, Kamakwi, Pinkolo, Madina, Fadugu, Kamasasa, Mabonto, and Kamasigi. The Bolom, Limba, and Loko were already original inhabitants of Sierra Leone. Tribes like the Shebro, Timni, and Mende would also become known as early inhabitants, but the formation of these tribes and the regions they inhabit would be carved out by the Mani people after they invaded and conquered most of the country in the 16th century. To fully understand the story of the Bolom, Shebro, Loko, Timni, and Mende, we must first understand the story of the Mani people. There are many origin theories of the Mani, including their origin stemming from a female leader called Masariko, who was expelled from the Mali Empire after offending the Mansa because she thought his leadership was weak, and left with a large army of Mani warriors who helped her conquer, subjugate, and absorb the native tribes of the new lands, and forced their prisoners of war to join their army. Historically and culturally, though, a more precise location of origin would be Kabu. The Mani were warlords and rulers of the Mandinka elite from the declining Mali Empire, but their homeland was a vassal state of Mali at the time called Kabu. Kabu was formed by a war general called Touramagan Traoré in French West Africa, or Touramagan Tarawali in English-speaking West Africa. Touramagan was the general and nephew of the founder of the Mali Empire, Sanjata Keita, through Sanjata's elder sister, Nana Tribon. In the 1230s, Touramagan defeated a great Banuk king called Kikokor and formed Gabu as a western province of Mali, and Touramagan would name himself the first Mansaba of the vassal state. Gabu was based in modern-day Guinea-Bissau, but their territory would also expand into the Senegambia as well. Once Touramagan defeated the Banuk king, he would marry a Jola woman, who was a known powerful sorceress. His descendants would take on the surnames Sane and Mane, which were both of Jola origin as well. The ruling class was composed of warrior elites made rich by slaves captured in war. These ruling nobles were from two distinctive sets of clans, Koring and Nyanko. The Korings were from Sanyang and Sonko clans, whilst the Nyankos were Mane and Sane. The Korings ruled the non-royal provinces, while only those descended from Nyanko bloodlines on both sides would be elected as Mansa. When we look at the timeline of Mali, Gabu, and the Mani invasion of Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, it becomes easier to tie in the knots. After the middle of the 14th century, Mali saw a steep decline due to the raids by the Mosi in the south and the growth of the new Songhai Empire to the north, as well as succession disputes. The Mali Empire would continue declining in the late 1400s, especially under the rule of Mansa Mahmud Keita II, who came to rule in 1481. His reign was described as a period where Mali would lose much of its territory. Mansa Mahmud was likely the Mansa who the Mani leader Masariko offended, because weak leadership seems to be synonymous with his reign, and it was said that Masariko's conquest towards Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia had begun in the early 1500s, not too long after Mahmud would come into power, and Gabu would become independent from Mali in the year 1537. After Masariko's expulsion, her and the Mani would establish themselves in the Bela region of Musadugu in modern-day Guinea. From Guinea, they would travel further south until reaching Cape Mount, Liberia, where the border is shared with southeastern Sierra Leone. Upon entering these regions, the Mani would encounter the indigenous Bulum people at Cape Mount in 1845. The Bulum were indigenous to Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. At Cape Mount, the Mani and Bulum would fight a major battle against each other, where Masariko's son was killed, and she died soon after. The rest of her army would continue west and conquer the southern regions of Sierra Leone. From the south, they would make their way towards the northern region of the country, absorbing and assimilating those they defeated along the way. Once the Mani entered the southern region of Sierra Leone, many Bulum settlements were destroyed during these invasions. This enabled the Mandinka to fully take over the south and force the Bulum to give them their allegiance. After the Mani conquered this region, they would begin intermixing with the Bulum people, and this fusion of the Mani and the Bulum would form the Mende tribe, who inhabit the same region today. The name Mende may derive from the names of their conquerors Mani, or a spin-off to the ancestry of their conquerors, which is Mande, the umbrella term for the Mande-speaking people of West Africa. Or perhaps, when the Europeans made contact with them and asked who they were, the reply that they received was Mande, but the British pronunciation likely came out as Mandai, hence the pronunciation and spelling today. Corruption and mispronunciation of African names and words by European explorers and invaders was common, and whatever they documented on the African people would be what was passed down to us who are the descendants, including the improper way of saying some of our ancestral names. Another example of this can be displayed through the formation of the Chebro people. After conquering the Bullum people of the south and forming the Mende, the next region that the Mani would conquer would be the Bullum territory centered around what is today known as Chebro Island. The head of this conquest was a Mani leader named Sherabola. A corruption of this name would lead to him being called Chebro, and from the corruption of this Mani leader's name, the Chebro tribe was formed. From there, the Timni would be conquered next, but prior to the Mani invasion of Sierra Leone, the Timni would be the first migrant tribe to arrive in the country after leaving the Fouta Djallon region of Guinea in the late 1400s. The Timni would push the Limba northeast and the Bullum southward. It is highly possible that before the arrival of the Mani, the Timni may have possibly gone by a different name. It is important to note that unlike other modern Mande groups, the Timni are related to the Landuma, Nalu, and Baga people of Guinea and Guinea-Bissau. These groups have been described as pre-Mandinkas because they settled in the region before the arrival of the Mande people. I find it interesting that the Soninke people also predate the Mandinka as well, yet there is still record of this pre-existence. But there is no record of the Timni until they made their presence in Sierra Leone, which heavily indicates that prior to them settling there, they likely were identifying under a different name or originally a subgroup of the Baga people. More evidence of this is that the Timni language is included within the Baga language family. The Timni government, titles of power, and culture is heavily influenced from the Mande and Kru-speaking Mani, so it is not unlikely that after subjugation, the conquered group took on a new name, culture, and form of governance, just as the Bullum did in the south when they became the Mende and Chebro tribes. These are other spelling variations of Timni that are listed below. The most consistent factor is the Mani, Mene, and Mini suffix at the end of each variation. Despite the various spelling variations, Timni only has two ways of pronouncing it, which is Timni or Timani, and this still maintains the Mani or Mini suffix, showing further indication that their name is derived from the Mani warriors who conquered them. When Masariko and the Mani started their conquest, her lieutenants were referred to as Sumbas and consisted of Kru-speaking people of the Koya and Kia clans from Liberia, who were likely absorbed into the army after the Mani conquered regions in Liberia. As the Mani generals were conquering the southern region of Sierra Leone, the Lieutenant Sumbas may have led the northern conquest against the Timni, because the Timni would go on to form the Kingdom of Koya, fully indicating that the Sumbas from the Koya clan played a major role in conquering them. The first three kings of Koya were documented by the name Farima, which wasn't their actual name but a title. Farima is a Mandinka term that translates to brave man, commander, or military leader in a Mandinka army. This is full evidence that after the Koya clan conquered the Timni, the Mani generals would be who took kingship. So now the newly formed Mende, Chebro, and Timni would become fully assimilated and trained to be a part of the Mani army. The Timni would conquer the Loko and intermix with them heavily, becoming the ruling class amongst them. The only tribe that was able to bring a halt to the Mani conquest in the north were the Susu. Overall, the Mani were able to conquer and absorb the Bullum and then create hybrid groups that would form the Mende, Chebro, Timni, and Loko. Salon man them always like for say, Uda indigenous, Uda not so indigenous. Well, I come for tell you now, if you not to Limba, you yourself, you're not so indigenous, you're not foreign man. Basically what I said was, Sierra Leoneans often enter into petty tribalistic debates over who's indigenous to the land and who's not. But in reality, if you're not Limba, then you're not fully indigenous to the land either. The Bullum would have been another indigenous group, but they've been fully absorbed and assimilated into the current tribes existing today. The Mende, Chebro, and Loko would be the next closest thing, but they only have partial indigenous ancestry from the Bullum, while the other half comes from the Mandinka invaders. Then the Timni are just foreigners who intermix with foreigners. They are a mixture of the Baga people of Guinea, Mandinka from the Mani clan, Kru people from the Koya and Kia clan, and a small percentage of Bullum sprinkled in there. The rest of the tribes in Sierra Leone are migrants from Mali, Guinea, and Liberia who settled later on. So I think we all able to say, Salon not a real place. We all not foreign man. We come Salon, we fet the bolom, we fet the limba, and we tell them say, you go accept we. If you no accept we no go have peace in this country. So this indigenous debate, not a thing where we get for faith, but today, all man na Salon man. You hear me? All man na Salon man. So now that we've broken down the Mani invasion, we're now able to go into other tribes as well too that migrated from other regions. The Susu and Yalunka are traders who originally migrated from Guinea to Sierra Leone. Both groups are primarily found in the far north in Cambia and Koinadugu district, close to the border with Guinea. The Susu and Yalunka kingdom was established in the early 5th to 7th century before the Mali Empire, which was extended from Mali, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea-Conakry, and the northern part of Sierra Leone. They are among the original inhabitants of the Fouta Djallon region in Guinea. The Susu and Yalunka are descendants of the greater Mande people, and today they are virtually all Muslim. The Yalunka, also spelled as Jalonke, are Mande people who have lived in the Djallon mountainous regions in Sierra Leone, Mali, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and Guinea-Conakry, West Africa, over 520 years ago. The name Yalunka literally means inhabitants of Djallon. Most of those who settled in Sierra Leone were pushed out by the Fula. The Susu are descendants of their Manding ancestors who lived in the mountainous Mali-Guinea border. They are said to have originally been a section of the Sonaninke people that migrated out of Ouagadougou and were initially a clan of blacksmiths who displayed their clear intentions to object converting to Islam. In the 12th century, when the kingdom of Ouagadougou was in decline, they migrated south and established the capital city of Susu and the mountainous region of Kolikoro. In Kolikoro, the Yalunka sub-tribe of the Susu would form during the tyrannical reign of Susumaru Kante. After Sanjata Keita defeated Kante, the Susus were ruled by the 13th century Mali Empire. In the 15th century, they migrated west to the Fouta Djallon plateau of Guinea as the Mali Empire disintegrated, but may have had earlier migrations as well. The Kono people are descendants of Mali-Guinean migrants who were said to have moved to Sierra Leone and settled in what is now the Kono district in the mid-16th century. Kono history claims that Kono were once a powerful people in Mali and Guinea. The Kono migrated to Sierra Leone as peaceful hunters. The tribe was split during the partitioning of Africa by European colonists, and part of the tribe still exists in the neighboring Guinea. Kono comes from the Mande word Makono, which means wait until we come back. So the Kono are actually just Mandinka people who were cut off from the others after Sierra Leone became separate from Guinea. Attacks from the related Mende people forced the Kono to seek refuge in the Karonko territory to the north, where they were allowed to farm the land. The Mende eventually moved further south, and the Kono returned to their land in the east. The Kono today practice Christianity, Islam, and traditional religion. They are primarily miners and farmers, and they make up 5.2% of the country's total population. Their homeland is the Kono district in eastern Sierra Leone. The Gisi are the fourth largest ethnic group in Guinea, making up 6.2% of the population. Gisi people are found in Liberia and Sierra Leone. The Gisi tradition considers that before the 17th century they inhabited the upper Niger region. Supposedly, they lived south of the Fouta Djallon until the Yalunka expelled them. After 1600, they migrated westward, expelling the Limbas in their march, but were under constant threat from the Karonkos. This threat is likely what caused their migration into Sierra Leone. The Gisi are well known for making baskets and weaving on vertical looms. In past times, they were also famous for their ironworking skills, as the country and its neighbors possessed rich deposits of iron. Kisi smiths produced the famous Kisi penny, which was a form of currency in the Mande-speaking world in the form of iron. The Karonko people occupy a large section in the mountainous regions of northeastern Sierra Leone and southern Guinea. Karonko speak a language similar to the Manding languages, and their language can be understood by their neighbors and close allies, the Mandinka and the Susu. The Karanko moved into Sierra Leone from Mali after some leadership struggles in the empire. It is highly likely that the Karanko were originally a subgroup of the Mandingo, and like the Mani, they may have decided to leave Mali altogether due to the weak leadership of Mansa Mahmud during the declining status of the empire. But during the height of Mali, the Karankos were originally a part of the military power of the country. Due to the vastness of the empire and their role in the military, they were deployed across East to West Africa. One of the most prominent military groups was led by a warrior named Mansa Kama, who lived approximately between 1650 and 1720. He was in charge of securing the West African trade route to the ports in present-day Freetown. Mansa Kama founded Kamadugu, now contained within the Sengbe chiefdom of Koinadugu district, as well as Khalifa, which is still a chiefdom to this day, and extended his rule across Sierra Leone, Foredugu, to the port in Koya. Mansa Kama eventually settled in Roala, which became the center of the new Karanko country, where he remained a leader until his death. The Karanko are primarily traders, farmers, and hunters, and followers of the Islamic faith today. The Mandingo people of Sierra Leone are direct descendants of people from Guinea and Mali who were traders, warriors, princes, Muslim clerics, and refugees who settled Sierra Leone between the 1870s and early 1900s. The main two reasons for their migration into the country was usually escaping French colonialism and enslavement back in Mali or Guinea, or the second reason would be fleeing or being subjugated by the jihads led by Samori Touré, a ruler of the Wasulu Empire. After Wasulu fell to the French in 1898, many of its subjects settled in Guinea and Sierra Leone. The Kenadugu Empire, ruled by the Traoré, also known as Tarawali, would also fall to the French in the same year after they defeated Babemba Traoré in battle. This would lead to some of their subjects also settling in Guinea and Sierra Leone in an attempt to evade French colonialism. In fact, the Koinadugu district of Sierra Leone was likely named by the Mandinka descendants of Kenadugu. Today, the Mandingo are predominantly traders and farmers. They constitute about 7% of Sierra Leone's population. The Mandingo are over 99% Muslim adherents to the Sunni tradition of Islam. The population is largely concentrated in Koinadugu district in the north, particularly in the towns of Kabala and Falaba, where they form the majority of the population. The Mandingo make up a majority of the population in Yangema, Kono district in eastern Sierra Leone, and they also make up a majority of the population in the town of Karina and Bambali district in the north of Sierra Leone. The Fula people are descendants of 17th and 18th century Fulani migrant settlers from the Fouta Djallon regions of Guinea, Mali, Senegal, and Mauritania. The Sierra Leone Fula people settled in the western area of Sierra Leone more than 60 years ago as settlers from mainly the Fouta Djallon region expanded to the northern part of Sierra Leone, primarily Kabala and Bambali. The Sierra Leonean Fula are traditionally a nomadic pastoralist trading people, herding cattle, goats, and sheep across the vast dry hinterlands of their domain, keeping somewhat separate from the local agricultural populations. Many of the large shopping centers in Sierra Leone are owned and run by the Fula community. A significant number of the Sierra Leone Fula population are found in all regions of Sierra Leone as traders, and many live in middle-class homes. Because of their trading, the Fulas are found in nearly all parts of the country. The Kru Vai and Gola are tribes that inhabit Sierra Leone today, but originally come from Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire. They migrated and settled along various points of West African coast, notably Freetown, Sierra Leone, but also the Ivorian and Nigerian coast. The Kuru are a large ethnic group that is made up of several sub-ethnic groups, including the Bassa, who also inhabit Sierra Leone to a small percentage. During the Atlantic slave trade, Kuru people were considered more valuable as traders and sailors on slave ships than as slave labor. To ensure their status as free men, they initiated the practice of tattooing their foreheads and the bridge of their nose with indigo dye to distinguish them from slave labor. Their maritime expertise evolved along the west coast of Africa, where they made a living as fishermen and traders. Knowing the inshore waters of the western coast of Sierra Leone and Africa and having nautical experience, they were employed as sailors, navigators, and interpreters aboard slave ships, as well as American and British warships used against the slave trade. The Sierra Leonean Vi are predominantly found in Pujaun district, around the Liberian border. Many Sierra Leonean villages that border Liberia are populated by the Vi. In total, only about 1,200 Vi live in Sierra Leone. They were referred to as the Galena people by the Portuguese and began migrating southwest, crossing Sierra Leone borders in search of salt and cola. The Gola people are a sub-tribe of the Koya clan from Liberia. During the Mani invasion, it is highly likely that the Koya who went north and conquered the Baga would become the Timni, and the Koya who remained in the southern region of Sierra Leone by the Liberian border would become the Gola. So the Gola are a combination of the Mani from the Mandinka clan, the Koya clan from Liberia, and the indigenous Bolon people. This makes them closely related to the Timni, the Baga, Shebro, Mende, and Kisi tribes as well. The Gola people are also called the Gullah, and during the transatlantic slave trade, many slaves were captured from the Gola tribe as well as Mende and sent to the Sea Islands of South Carolina to work on rice plantations due to their specialty in this field. The Gola and Gisi people of Sierra Leone and the Bantu people from Angola are said to be the origin of the name Gullah Geechee in South Carolina. Though most scholars would agree that the word Gullah in reference to the Gullah Geechee people of South Carolina is derived from the Gola people of Sierra Leone and the Bantu-speaking people of Angola, some scholars would say that the word Geechee is derived from the Ogeechee River in South Carolina and Georgia, or some would say that it comes from the Kisi people or the Gisi people of Liberia and Guinea. And last but not least, we have the Creole people. Who are the Sierra Leonean Creole people? Where did they come from? The Creole people of Sierra Leone have a unique story and ancestry. They are not considered to be one of the indigenous tribes of Sierra Leone because of their history and origins. The Creole people's origins come from various parts of West and Central Africa. From 1619 to the mid-1700s, their ancestors were captured from these regions and enslaved in America and the Caribbean. They were predominantly being sent to the American colonies of Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. Their ancestors would become amongst those who would help to form the Gullah Geechee community. In 1775 to 76, the Revolutionary War would begin.
here at the Council on Foreign Relations, and this is my first event presiding, not as a member, but as a member of the staff of the Council. And so I'm thrilled to be here, and I just, if you don't mind, want to give a shout out to my other military fellows and intelligence and nuclear fellows that are also here, really soaking up you and the community, and we're really looking forward to it this year. It's so great to see so many friends in the audience. My first job was covering the United Nations, and so I'm thrilled to be here with Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Just a couple of quick announcements. Just want to remind you that this meeting is on the record. We're joined here by council members here in New York and more than 250 on Zoom. So the ambassador is going to make some remarks, and then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll open it up to questions from you. Thank you so much for being here.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here with all of you, and let me just start by thanking the Council on Foreign Relations for having me today and for having me at other locations as well. And I particularly want to thank you, Elise, for taking the time to sit down with me and for what I know will be a very insightful conversation. I was looking at your bio and I saw that you graduated from University of Wisconsin, so we have that in common. So I'll look forward to, off the record, having a talk about your experiences in the Badger State. Today we officially begin the 10-day countdown to High Level Week. First Avenue traffic cones have started to emerge from hibernation. The coffee shops have begun girding themselves for the morning crush. All of the meetings, all of the marathon bilats, the side events, the plenaries that we will be having, they offer us the opportunity to take stock of where we are and, more importantly, where we're going as an international community. But before we dive into the future of multilateralism, I want to take a moment to step back to the past. The year is 1965, two decades out from the end of World War II and the start of the United Nations. The world is experiencing rapid decolonization across Africa, Asia, South America, and the UN has grown accordingly from 51 member states in 1945 to 117 just 20 years later. All the while, the multilateral system is being tested by a number of challenges. Of course, there's the Cold War, the growing threat of nuclear conflict, and rapid advancements in science and technology. Against this backdrop, the world is asking big questions about the United Nations, whether this institution is representative and legitimate, whether it's built to meet the challenges of the day as well as the challenges of the future. And in particular, member states are looking at the Security Council. Up until this point, the Council counted only 11 members, and its composition reflected the world as it was in 1945, rather than the realities of the 1960s. There was, for example, no seat reserved for Africa, but there was one for British Commonwealth countries. There was a seat allotted to Western Europe, in addition to the permanent seats held by France and the United Kingdom, but only one to be shared between Eastern Europe and all of Asia. Faced with a crisis of confidence, it was clear that the UN needed to evolve, and the United States had a decision to make. We could fight that evolution or get on board with it. The rest, as they say, is history. In the years to come, we saw dramatic change in how the UN approached peacekeeping and development, technology, and science. And in 1965, during UN Ambassador Arthur Goldberg's earliest days in office, we saw change in the size and the composition of the UN Security Council. 11 seats grew to 15, with new non-permanent seats allocated to Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And that's the way it has been ever since. Which brings us to today. The post-Cold War era is over, and we have another moment of profound change and tremendous challenge to the world and the multilateral system that governs it. I think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the most serious shock to the UN system since its inception. Here was a permanent member of the Security Council undermining the UN's founding principles: sovereignty, territorial integrity, human rights. But in addition to the violations that strike at the very heart of the Charter, there was also the challenges and opportunities its drafters could have never imagined 80 years ago. Crises like climate change and COVID-19, humanitarian catastrophes, often born of conflict and insecurity in every corner of the world, from Sudan to Gaza to Haiti and elsewhere. New technologies like artificial intelligence, and a United Nations with 193 member states representing 8 billion people across the world, many of whom are still striving to live healthy, prosperous, free, and dignified lives. The world is only continuing to grow and change, so it's clear that it's past time, once again, for this institution to grow and change too. Now, just as then, countries have a decision to make. We can fight for that evolution, or we can help lead it. For our part, we've seen the consequences of choosing incorrectly, and there's nothing better than learning from your mistakes. We've learned in recent years that when we abandon our leadership, other world powers are all too eager to fill the vacuum and shape the world order towards their undemocratic ends. That's why at the beginning of his administration, President Biden announced that the United States was back. We were back at the United Nations, and we were ready to pursue relentless diplomacy to address the challenges that matter most to people's lives. Over nearly 4 years, we've worked to do just that, to defend democracy and uphold the UN Charter, to lead UN action on everything from food security to gender equity, to reinvest in the UN system and put forward top-tier American talent to take on key UN roles. But to achieve the future we all collectively seek, we need to do more than work within the UN system as it is. We need to ask ourselves, how can we reshape the UN? How can we reshape the UN and the multilateral system more broadly to meet the challenges of this century? The Biden-Harris administration has sought through our words and our actions to answer that very question. Rethinking how we deploy peacekeeping operations, including through a new arrangement that empowers AU missions to respond to Africa's growing security challenges. Drafting and securing adoption of the first ever UN resolution establishing rules on artificial intelligence. Strengthening the capacity of multilateral development banks to support developing economies. Championing sanctions reform to ensure humanitarian carve-outs, all while supporting the Secretary General's Summit of the Future initiative. It is clear that we have a ways to go. So much of the UN system needs reform and it needs reinvigoration. And in the words of the late Madeleine Albright, my friend and my mentor, she stated, and I quote, "Institutions like people 70 and over need a little bit of refurbishing," unquote. Of course, I wouldn't know anything about that as a 25-year-old, despite the fact that I've been doing this work for over 40 years. But among the most glaring anachronisms of this institution, 70 and over, is the one we grapple with all the way back to 1965, the composition of the UN Security Council. And I'm hardly the first to say this. For years, Countries have been calling for a more inclusive and a more representative council, one that reflects the demographics of today's world and better responds to the challenges that we face today. It's why 2 years ago, President Biden announced that the United States supports expanding the Security Council to provide permanent representation for countries from Africa, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean, that in addition to the countries we long supported for permanent seats, India, Japan, and Germany, we would support Africa and the Latin America and the Caribbean. After that announcement, I embarked on what I called a listening tour to see how we could make the president's vision a reality. And I've met with over 80 countries, asking leaders what they want to see in a reformed council. Secretary Blinken and his team have engaged in Washington and in foreign capitals. You know, there's a saying, if you ask the United Nations a question, you'll get 193 answers. Well, the question of whether and how to change the Security Council was no exception. But for all of these disagreements, these differences, there was one thing everyone agreed on. The status quo was just not cutting it, and it's time to make change. So in addition to reform commitments we've already made, today I'm announcing the United States supports 3 additional changes to the Security Council. First, I want to start with Africa. This is in many ways personal to me. As you know, I have lived and worked across the continent. I have traveled extensively across Africa, and so I know firsthand the diversity and the talent, the depth and breadth of expertise and experiences on the African continent. As it stands, there are currently 3 non-permanent seats on the Security Council allocated to African countries on a rotating basis for 2 years. The problem is these elected seats don't enable African countries to deliver the full benefit of their knowledge and voices to the work of the Council, to consistently lead on the challenges that affect all of us and disproportionately affect Africa. That is why, in addition to non-permanent memberships for African countries, the United States supports creating 2 permanent seats for Africa on the Council. It's what our African partners seek, and we believe this is what is just. From Kenya's contribution to the multilateral security support mission in Haiti, to Gabon's support to protect our planet, we have seen how African leadership not only benefits the lives of Africans, but people across the globe. So now it's time for African leadership to have a permanent place on the Security Council too. Second, since its founding, the Security Council has reserved rotating seats for different regions. But the truth is, even countries that border each other can be more different than similar. And conversely, even countries miles apart are more similar than different. In particular, over the past few years, we've heard from a number of member states that it's time to rethink and look beyond just regional representation and consider reserving a seat on the Council for small island developing states. Now, to be clear, there are 39 of these states, so it's not a monolith. They are home to 65 million people across over 1,000 islands, but each has critical insights on a range of international peace and security issues, including notably the impact of climate change. In fact, I met with Pacific Island countries earlier today and heard some of their priorities focused on issues related to the impact of sea rise and climate change. These perspectives deserve consistent representation, and so I'm also proud to announce that the United States supports creating a new elected seat on the Security Council for small island developing states. We've never had this kind of cross-regional rotating seat before, but far more important than president is a Security Council that is representative, inclusive, and can lead us into the future. And that gets me to my third and final announcement. Much of the conversation around Security Council reform has been just that. It's a conversation. We sit around the table every year, and as one of my colleagues said, we just give the same speech over and over and over again. And so many of these countries I've talked to, spanning vastly different approaches and opinions, agree that it's time to stop talking in circles, stop repeating what we've said year in and year out, and take action. To actually put down our principles on paper and begin the process of getting a resolution over the finish line. Now, there are those who disagree with this. They argue that before we begin negotiations on a resolution, all 193 member states need to be in agreement about what a reform council should look like. Just imagine, all 193 of us. I'm an optimist, though, and I'm also a realist. And the reality is this: no amount of conversations will ever get us to a place of total consensus on this issue. The good news is we've been here before. Back in the 1960s, when the General Assembly last decided to expand the Council, very few member states were in agreement on how to proceed. Despite deep divides, member states understood the gravity of the moment they were in, and so they chose to not let perfect be the enemy of the good. They rolled up their sleeves and they got to work. Now it's time for us to do exactly the same. And so my final announcement is that the United States supports engaging in text-based negotiations on council reform. And this may seem weedy inside baseball news, but it's actually a big deal. It means we're ready to work with other countries to negotiate language, prepare amendments, and ready this resolution for a vote in the General Assembly and ultimately amend the UN Charter. Look, I regularly say diplomacy is hard. And diplomacy, about the composition and core mission of our multilateral system is especially challenging. But if there's anything I've learned from nearly 4 years at the UN and nearly 4 decades as a diplomat, it's the power of personal engagement to overcome seemingly insurmountable differences. That when you sit down, actually sit down and talk to people, leave your ego outside the door and your agenda outside the door, and you talk to them in good faith and in good spirit, you can actually find common ground. And that's why I've made it my mission to have personal bilateral conversations with every one of the 188 countries the United States has diplomatic relations with. 3.5 years, we only have a few more to go. As we head into the final high-level week of the Biden administration, I'm eager to have even more of these honest, productive conversations, to collaborate on solutions to make the UN development system more accountable and more coherent, and the UN humanitarian system more efficient and more effective, to find ways to increase transparency, address emerging technologies, and incorporate gender and racial equality in our work, and to finally begin building a representative, inclusive council fit for the 21st century. You know, when faced with the prospects of reform in the 1960s, the United States was, shall we say, less than enthusiastic. One State Department official summed it up best with, change on the horizon, the U.S. would quote, do better to acquiesce in enlargement than fight it. Today, we have the responsibility to do better than just acquiesce. The United States can and must lead. We must lead with an affirmative agenda for the future of multilateralism, one that lives up to the values enshrined in the past, but also one that is in line with the realities of the present, and one that allows us to meet the challenges and the opportunities to come in the future. So with that, I'm excited to dive into the discussion and the challenges and opportunities with Elise. Elise, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that news-making speech. And thank you for making those announcements at the council. We're thrilled to dive in. It is true that, you know, we call the UNGA speed dating because you have all those meetings and those bilaterals and plenaries. Let's talk about, you know, dive into what you discussed here. Now, look, as you said, this isn't the first time you've pushed for reform. No, they didn't turn my mic on. I do have quite a loud voice, so can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, let's just dive in. You know, critics might say that, you know, pushing for reform, you know how difficult this is going to be. How do you ensure that this is not a symbolic gesture, that this is not just about optics and substance? Because it's going to be so difficult. It's going to be such a difficult process. How do you convince skeptical nations? I mean, we just have to start with that, right? Especially in the global south, that this is not virtue signaling, that you are really trying to make a genuine push for reform.
Well, first of all, we can't avoid something because it's hard. If we avoided diplomacy because it's hard, we would never do it. So I acknowledge that this is not going to be easy. But I have engaged with, as I said, more than 80 countries on this. And they are all excited about this possibility because what the United States did is that we kind of opened the door a little bit wider than it had ever been opened before by openly discussing our own position. There was a time when we didn't support this. And so, yes, it required some convincing. It required a lot of engagement. And I have done that engagement relentlessly over the past 2 years. And I think everyone that I've spoken to, they've all agreed that this is the direction we want to go in. Do they agree with every detail of what we're proposing? No, this is what negotiations are for. But what they agree to is that it's time to move the needle on this and move it significantly. When I spoke to the Sierra Leone PR, I think he used the word, this is seismic. I wouldn't have gone that far.
Well, it'll be seismic if it happens, right?
Yeah. It's seismic that it is happening.
Okay.
And now we have to go the next level and make it a reality.
Okay, a lot of countries have said over the years that they were in support of reform. Now they're really going to have to put their cards on the table. You've laid out your position, and now you're going to be looking for other countries to kind of put up or shut up that they have to show whether they really support or not. That's what these text-based negotiations are about?
That's exactly what the text-based negotiations will allow. And what the co-facilitators have suggested is that countries kind of put together their models for UN reform on the table in writing. And we sit with those models and use that as the basis for negotiations.
So you said you've learned from your mistakes. This is not the first effort at UN reform. What have you learned in these past efforts that you're going to apply now to make sure that this effort is different than the past?
Well, we've already started to show that, and that is the significant engagements that we've had over the course of the past 2 years. We are talking to people. There is no country too small, no country insignificant, because when we go into the General Assembly to vote, every vote counts. And so we know that we have to engage with everyone. We have to engage with the small island developing countries. We have to engage with small countries in Africa. We have to engage with the landlocked developing countries. We have to engage with the P5. We have to engage with other regions. So we have engaged with, we're pretty much engaged with the world.
So, you know, these are text-based negotiations, and I know how painstaking these negotiations can be on just a resolution. So how do you ensure that this doesn't fall victim to the same gridlock that has stalled meaningful changes, and ensure that these negotiations lead to results? And how do you balance the urgency of reform with this painstaking process?
You know, we're not putting a time frame on this. To put a time frame on this would probably set us up for failure. So we are relying on the co-facilitators to lead this process as they have done over many years and move forward the discussions. But those painstaking negotiations we do, and I commend my staff. Sometimes I hear that they're negotiating to 4 a.m. in the morning, ordering out for pizza to continue the negotiations. This is going to be hard. And we're going to have to do that deep dive into this. But I think what I've heard from everyone is it's time. And it has to happen. And we have to start the work on this now.
You know, when you tell people UN reform, new members, per members on the councils, the first thing is that they say that Russia and China are unlikely to support it because it's going to diminish their influence. And how do you plan to overcome that opposition, specifically due to their veto power?
Look, again, this is going to be tough negotiations, and it's not going to just be us talking to Russia and China. It's going to be the other 190 plus countries, the other 10 members of the Security Council, talking to Russia and China about what they want to see in terms of changes. And so, again, I think their influence with our influence, as well as the interests of Russia and China, will certainly come into play. But I think we can, and again, I'm not being Pollyannish, but I am being optimistic that I think we can come to an agreement. Will it be a perfect agreement? No. To get to consensus, we will all have to negotiate away some of our own priorities.
Okay, so permanent membership comes with a lot of perks, just like council membership comes with a lot of perks, and that's the veto. So these new members, are they going to have veto power?
So we've been very, very clear that we do not support expansion of the veto. And, you know, I've had a number of discussions with my African colleagues who put this kind of take it or leave it position on the table. We get 2 seats and we get the veto. And the reason we want the veto is because you have it. But the reason we hate the veto is because it makes the council dysfunctional.
Right.
And so if veto power makes the council dysfunctional in their view, why would you expand it? And that's what I have said to them. Why would you want to expand the veto power? What you should be working to do is what your actual goal is to limit the veto power. And I don't know, what will go into the negotiations that will get us to a place of common ground. But I think we can get there.
Well, and I think we all know that the veto is so destructive, especially when it comes to Russia and China using their veto power. So why retain it? Why don't we just have permanent members and nobody has a veto?
Yeah, and we have veto power as well, and none of the permanent members want to give up their veto power, including us. I'm being honest about that. We don't want to give up our veto power, and we do think if we expand that veto power across the board, it will make the council more dysfunctional.
Okay, but on the other hand, if you don't have veto power, then what is the power of membership?
Well, one is that they can permanently engage on issues of significance to them and actually help the council to do its work. The veto power is not all-encompassing. I was just checking before coming here. We've passed over 180 resolutions in the past 4 years. And these resolutions are passed with countries engaging with us to ensure that their priorities, their values are in those resolutions. So the council works despite the veto power.
Okay, you've announced support for new permanent seats for countries like Germany, India, and Japan. Where do you draw the line? I mean, how do you decide which nations deserve permanent seats and not excluding other growing powers like Brazil or South Africa, for instance?
You know, we have indicated that we support 2 permanent seats for Africa. How that plays out on the African continent will be up to the Africans to determine.
So the Africans will determine who those permanent members
They're
are?
going to run and have to be voted on by 193 members, but who are their candidates for this? They'll decide that themselves.
Because we
it's
know,
not for me to tell the Africans,
right,
you need to take South Africa, or you need to take Egypt, or you need to take Kenya. They will determine who will run for their seats.
Right, but I mean, the U.S., even when you're talking about which members are up for voting on the Security Council, U.S. surely has a lot of influence working with those nations. And so how do you navigate regional politics within Africa to ensure that there's fair representation without deepening these existing rivalries on the continent?
Again, I think this is going to be for the Africans to determine. But yes, we do have influence. We'll express our views. We're going to vote, and we're going to show an interest in particular candidates over other candidates. But will the candidate that we are in favor of win? I don't know. Again, I will leave it to the Africans to determine who they will put on the ballot to run before the General Assembly.
Okay. I'm intrigued by this new seat for the small island developing states as an innovative idea. But given the kind of scale and complexity of these challenges that you discussed, how do you ensure these are small states, they're subject to influence from bigger permanent members? How do you ensure that they have a meaningful voice in the Security Council decisions and not a symbolic one that gets kind of drowned out by those heavier powers?
We see it every day. We have small countries who are participating as elected members of the Security Council. And I can tell you, working with those countries and seeing how they operate in they guard their sovereignty and their independence and their control of their own positions very, very strongly. And so they lay out their positions and they work with us. They work with others. They will push us, and as well as the Chinese and the Russians, to support positions that they have. And we will engage with them to support positions that we have. But what I've seen in almost all the cases is that they vote based on their own commitments and their own values.
Okay, so Security Council reform requires amending the UN Charter, which would also need a supermajority in the US Senate. Given the polarization we face in Congress, how realistic is it that you can pass the Senate, do you think? And have you had meetings with senators about this?
I have engaged with members on this, and we don't know what our Senate is going to look like and how they will be voting in the future. So we just have to play the cards that we have at hand when we deal our hand.
Right.
So there are a large number of members of Congress, senators, who are very pro-UN, who support reforms at the UN, and not just in the Security Council, but how to make the UN more efficient, how to make the UN more representative. So we will be engaging across the administration, from the State Department and the White House, with members of Congress once this becomes a reality. And again, I don't know when that will be.
Well, I mean, on that note, we could have we will have a new administration, but we could have a new party in Congress. We could have a new party in office and the presidency. How do you deal with the fact that, we've seen in the past with other issues that countries are kind of a little bit concerned about the consistency of the U.S. and that how do you ensure members that are already kind of might be skeptical of the process, that the U.S. is going to stay with this for the long term?
Look, they're just going to have to watch and see what happens. I think our political system is very public. People see, the thinkings of our political of our politicians, but I think there is a general sense that the United States across the board, that we value the United Nations despite what we might say otherwise, that there is a value to the United Nations and that we need the United Nations.
At the same time, the U.S. is the global superpower, and you do support multilateralism, but we also have a history in this country of acting unilaterally when we must. So how do you reconcile the commitment to doubling down on multilateralism while especially kind of maintaining that autonomy in global matters of peace?
Look, I think every country has their own priorities and value their bilateral relationships and their own values. None of them are unlike us. But I think when we get in the context of this United Nations down the road, people do think multilaterally. And they look for allies who will think like them. But when we're looking at our multilateral values, we're not pushing our unilateral values off the table, because those values feed into what we do at the United Nations. So yes, it could be problematic, but we'll face it when we get to it.
This is a very, kind of new thing that you're doing with the council, but let's just, the council itself has been, paralyzed by vetoes, geopolitical tensions. I mean, I think everyone in this room wants to know, is meaningful action still possible through the UN Security Council?
At least I just said we did 180 resolutions in the past 4 years, 180 resolutions. And most of them passed by consensus. What people tend to focus on is where we fail. That's the stuff that makes the news. It's newsworthy when the veto power is used. It is not newsworthy when we pass by consensus a resolution, when we pass a resolution supporting the Kenyan MSS into Haiti. We pass a resolution really redefining how we fund AU missions for peace support, passed a resolution that was historic to deal with how we deal with the impact of sanctions on humanitarian programs, so doing a carve-out for humanitarian work. And all of these resolutions were supported. Numerous resolutions that are dealing with regional issues that we pass every single day. So is the veto power used? Yes, it's used. But it is not used all the time. And I think we can count on our hands when we've used it.
That's a fair point. I think, though, we're thinking of these conflicts around the world, right? When I was covering the State Department, it was Syria. We couldn't get a resolution passed on Syria. Now it's hard to get a resolution, or let's go back to Lebanon in 2006. We couldn't get a resolution passed on Israel or Ukraine because of these veto powers. So maybe I should amend my question to be on these hard, thorny issues of peace and security. How do we get past this issue?
So it's hard. And I use that a lot. It's hard. But we've had four resolutions on Israel that we've passed in the past few months, dealing with the humanitarian situation. We actually regularly pass the resolution on Syria. Despite having the problems we had in the past, we were actually able to get a cross-border resolution that was passed over a number of years on Syria. So we'll keep trying to refine. We do intense negotiations. I negotiated for hours, personally negotiated on a resolution on humanitarian that we passed in December on Gaza, sitting with other members of the council, negotiating every single sentence, every comma, every and, but, the in the resolution, and we got the resolution passed. So again, with commitment, we can actually get the work done. Do we fail sometime? Unfortunately, we do. And every failure is difficult. Every veto is difficult.
I mean, on the issue of Israel, it just seems that, like you said, you're able to pass resolutions on Sudan or on Ethiopia and Eritrea, but when it comes to Israel, it seems that the council itself, but the larger UN body, has a hard time grappling with issues related to Israel and the Palestinians. And I think there's a lot of ambivalence about this conflict and what the council should do?
Yeah, I don't know if there's ambivalence. There is a lot of emotions around this issue. We see it every single day on the news. But as I said, we got 4 resolutions passed. And actually, people have forgotten that one resolution that we put on the table that actually brought all of these issues to the fore, we got 12 votes plus ours, and Russia vetoed that resolution. People forget that Russia vetoed that resolution. So yes, we do have problems, but again,
does the UN have an Israel problem?
I think that we have an Israel problem in the UN, and there is a inordinately over focus on Israel, even before Gaza, on Israel in the UN. It's something that we have raised on a regular basis. There's no other country in the world that has a monthly meeting on the council's agenda going back decades. So yes, there is an unfair amount of focus on Israel in the UN, and it is problematic.
One more question on Israel, and then I want to ask about Kenya and open it up to the audience. What is the U.S. going to do as more and more countries, as they are starting to recognize the Palestinian state, and the Palestinians are becoming eligible for membership in some of these organizations?
A state has certain responsibilities for its people. And I do not believe the Palestinians, as they exist right now, have all of the elements to give it statehood. And so, yes, there are a large number of states that are recognizing Palestinian statehood. They have now been given an alphabetized place in the General Assembly, but we have to deal with the issues of peace and security, and all of that is going to have to be negotiated between the two parties on the ground for this to work in an effective way.
The mandate for Kenya, the Kenyan-led mission in Haiti, is coming up in a few weeks. It's been facing significant shortages and delays and concerns about the accountability. Do you see a renewal of the mandate?
Yes.
You do. Do you think it can still achieve its objectives as it stands? I mean, they've been on the ground, but it's been a little bit hard kind of standing up.
They will achieve their mandate, and they are working toward that. I visited Haiti earlier this year, and I had an opportunity to meet with the Kenyans, to meet with the transitional Haitian Prime Minister and the Transitional Presidential Council, as well as civil society members in the UN. And I think there is a strong sense that the Kenyan presence is making a difference. We're not hearing all of the kinds of attacks that we were hearing before, and the Kenyans are getting more and more resources. They have engaged with the gangs on several occasions, and they have been quite successful in that engagement. More needs to be done, and more needs to be done faster. And we're all working to ensure that that happens. But I think the resolution is going to pass, and we're going to see the Kenyans continue to help the Haitian people achieve what they want, and that's peace and security.
Ambassador, thank you for the conversation. I'd like to open it up to members now, and here and online, to join our conversation. We'll begin with a question here in the room. This is a full room. If you could quickly identify yourself and your affiliation and ask a short question, we'll try to get as many as we can, and we'll also go to members online. Remember, this meeting is on the record.
I'm just looking. Thank you, Ambassador. I wanted to ask about the International Court of Justice decision ruling that Israel's occupation is illegal and must end, and ordering member states, including the United States, to end support for Israel that assists their settlements, as well as the impending arrest warrant against Netanyahu and the Israeli foreign minister. Are you going to abide by the International Court of Justice orders? Are you going to arrest Netanyahu and the foreign minister if he turns up in the United States? And, you know, what is your feeling on these international court rulings?
Let me start with the last part of that. We have a problem with the court's ruling. And we've been clear that we have a problem with the court's ruling. And I think you know the answer to the question about whether we will arrest President Netanyahu. He was here in the United States a few weeks ago, and he was not arrested. The warrant was out before that. Okay, well, let me be clear. We will not arrest him. And because we have a question about the jurisdiction of the ICC on Israel, and we've made that very, very clear.
Okay, we're going to go right here, and then we'll go to Evelyn in the front. Right here.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for a great discussion.
Thank you.
Is there anything in the UN Charter? Earl Carr, representing CJPA Global Advisors. Is there anything in the UN Charter which states how a member or non-member, how a member can be removed from the international community? Is there anything about that?
You have anybody in mind?
That's a great question, and it's a question I've been asked over and over again. And there is a provision, and I don't know if our lawyers are in the room, it's like 27C3 or something in the charter. That allows for a member to be kicked out of the Security Council and the UN. That has not been used recently. In fact, I don't even remember when it was used. Again, I will turn to the lawyers who may know the answer to that question. But it is not easy. It's not easy to do, and here's why it's not easy. Because and here's where we talk about the veto. The P5 can veto this, and the country that, of course, everybody's talking about is a P5 country.
Okay, we have a question online, and then we're going to go to Evelyn in the front, and I will try and get to as many questions as I can.
We'll take our next question from Mo Ibrahim.
Hi, Mo.
Hi, Mo.
Hi. Thank you, Secretary and Ambassador, and it's wonderful to see you on the screen. We have in Sudan a terrible war, and 150,000 people killed, 10 million refugees, 2 million immigrants to 7 neighboring countries. The UN adopted some time ago a duty to protect. Why the Security Council is not assuming so far its duty to protect?
Great question, Mo.
That is a great question. And I can tell you it has been extraordinarily difficult, even as a permanent member of the Security Council, to get the Council to pay attention to what is happening in Sudan. You've recited the statistics, the number of people killed, the number of people who've been forced from their homes and living in IDP situations, the number of refugees. It is, I would argue, the worst situation that we have seen in the world. And the divisions within the Council on how to address this, unfortunately, have been kind of aired in public. And what I would like to see, I would like to see the A3 members of the Security Council lead on this and push the Security Council to address these issues related to Sudan more consistently. We have had a number of meetings on the situation in Sudan. I've given press conference, I've written articles on the situation. The negotiations, as you know, to find a solution continue and to no avail. And I really think it's time that we ramp up our efforts to get more attention paid to this and get the UN engaged on the situation there. We've been able, the last negotiations, to get some progress on the humanitarian side, opening up humanitarian corridors, but it's not enough. It is absolutely not enough. And sometimes, Mo, people ask me, what keeps me awake at night, and it's Sudan, because people don't pay attention to Sudan. It's like crickets when we're talking about Sudan. We're focused on the situation in Gaza. We're focused on the situation in Ukraine, and we need to focus more attention on what is happening in Sudan.
Thank you. Again, if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll go to Evelyn, and then we'll go to this gentleman right here.
Hello, Ambassador. I'm Evelyn Leopold, an independent journalist at the UN and head of the Dag Hammarskjöld Fund for Journalists. God, you remind me of Sudan. I went there. I went to Darfur with the Security Council in 2003, and it looks like it hasn't changed much. But my question was, what did you have in mind for the so-called G4, Germany, Brazil, Japan, and India? Because Italy would object to Germany because it feels it's in competition. Brazil, the Latin Americans say it speaks the wrong language. Japan, China would object seriously. And India, Pakistan's already organizing as many Islamic states as it can against India.
Okay.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much for that question. On the G4, we have expressed our support for Japan and Germany and India. We have not explicitly expressed support for Brazil. India has the largest population in the world. And we really, really strongly support their being on the council, and I think there are just no grounds for denying India that. But there will be people who will be opposed to various countries for various reasons, and that's all going to be part of our negotiations moving forward.
Okay, we have one more question online.
We will take our next question from Keely Bahili Zvoga.
Thank you, Ambassador. Following up on an earlier question, Congress has threatened to withhold aid to the Palestinian Authority should it seek recognition as a full state at the UN, and also should it support the ICC's investigation. What is the position of the administration on this, on the withholding of aid should the ICC advance?
Look, Congress, we have three branches of government, and Congress has expressed its view on this through resolutions as well as in public statements. We certainly would not want to be in a situation where we withhold aid, needed aid from the Palestinian people, but we also are under the obligation to support whatever decisions that our Congress makes. So that's all I can say on that at the moment, and I'm hoping that we're not forced into facing that position at some point in the future.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Ambassador Stefano Vaccara, La Voce di New York, Ital Press. Is a follow-up of what Elise and others said about the reform. Just the last day that the President of the General Assembly, Francis, was with us, with the journalists, he said openly that he thinks the the P5, are not serious about any reform. I believe them. Now, you try to convince this audience and the world that you are serious this time. So can you say something more about this seriousness? And last thing is,
we want to get to a lot of questions, so
yes, the last thing is, if you actually are serious with the reform, are you going to stay if Vice President Harris wins? Are you going to stay?
I love how you slipped that in there.
We are serious about reform, and I know countries have questioned that commitment. I know that they have thrown all the P5 into one pot together and think that we're thinking and working together to ensure that UN reform doesn't happen, and that is not the case. I wouldn't be here today. President Biden wouldn't have made this announcement 2 years ago and the previous year. And we will continue to work on this until we achieve some of the changes that we want to see achieved. And as for my future, right now we got 4 months to get through to the end of the year, when I will serve as the president of the Security Council for a 4th time, and that is all I'm focused on.
That's not a no, though. Nathan in the back.
Hello, Nathan Colvin, New Army Fellow for this year here at the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm just wondering, with the violations of the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances for Ukraine, are there viable pathways forward for non-proliferation still, or is that an issue that just won't be touched anytime soon?
I think it's an issue that has to be dealt with, and we will continue to work to deal with it, despite the fact that it looks impossible. I mean, we have to.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, are you going to be able to do this reform through gumbo diplomacy? Tell us what gumbo diplomacy is.
Well, it's absolutely what I have been doing. It is sitting around the table, engaging with people to talk through your differences. It's not always about you're coming together with people that you agree with. But if you're able to sit around the table and talk through your differences and walk away from that table feeling that you have been heard, you've been respected, and that we can find a path forward, then you've achieved your goal. And that's what gumbo diplomacy is about for me. It's about people sitting around the table. I talk about gumbo, but I do more than just gumbo. But it's sitting around the table, having good food. And this is not something that I discovered or I made up. Every single one of you do it. You know that when you're sitting around the table, having a good meal, having a good conversation, you can come to some agreements and some commonalities, and that's what gumbo diplomacy is to me.
Well, Ambassador, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. Thank you all here and online. A reminder, this recording will be on the CFR website, and we hope you'll join us for UNGA Week. We'll be having a lot of world leaders and interesting people.
Thank you very much.